The envelope hit Clara Whitmore across the face before she even saw it coming. She stood in the parlor of her father's Beacon Hill townhouse, 19 years old and still wearing her house apron, when the thick cream-colored paper struck her cheek and fell to the Persian rug. Her father's lawyer, a thin man named Aldridge who smelled of pipe smoke and disapproval, didn't flinch. Her father didn't flinch either. He stood by the fireplace with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's finally decided to throw out. "You'll sign it," her father said, "or you'll leave this house with nothing but what you're wearing." Clara looked down at the envelope. She didn't pick it up right away. She understood, in the cold, certain way that only daughters of cruel men understand, that whatever was inside that envelope had already been decided without her. The signing was just a formality. The humiliation was the point. "What is it?" she asked, though she already felt the answer settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Her father looked at Aldridge. Aldridge looked at his shoes. "A marriage arrangement," her father said. "Montana territory. A man named Mercer. You leave on Thursday's train." If you were in that parlor, if you were the one standing on that rug with your cheek still stinging and your whole future being handed to a stranger in the Montana wilderness, what would you do? If this story already has you feeling something, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what happens next, and hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Clara, because what happens next changes everything. The trunk they gave her was her mother's. Old brown leather with brass fittings gone green at the corners, and a broken latch on the left side that had to be held shut with a length of rope. Clara packed it herself because no one offered to help. She folded her 2 wool dresses, her mending kit, a pair of boots that were already worn through at the left heel, and a small tin box of her mother's things. A cameo brooch, 3 letters tied with ribbon, a thimble. She sat on the edge of her bed afterward and looked at the trunk for a long time. She was not a beautiful girl. She knew this the way she knew the color of her own eyes. Not because someone had been cruel enough to say it plainly, but because beauty in her world was loud and obvious, and she had spent her entire life watching it happen to other women while she stood just outside the circle of it. She was tall where she should have been delicate. Her hands were wide. Her shoulders were broad. She had her mother's jaw, which was a strong jaw, and in a painting or a different century it might have been called handsome, but in Boston in 1887 it was simply called unfortunate. Her father had never used that word. He didn't need to. He had other ways of communicating the same thing. The way he seated her at the far end of the table at dinner parties. The way he introduced her to visitors, "My daughter Clara," with a pause just before her name. The way you pause before mentioning something you're embarrassed by. The way he had spent 3 years attempting to arrange a marriage for her in Boston and failing because Boston's eligible men had seen her at enough parlor teas to form their opinions, and those opinions were not kind. So now there was Montana. Clara did not cry while she packed. She had learned that crying was expensive. It cost you energy you needed for other things, and it never changed anything anyway. What she did was make herself a list in her head of everything she knew about Montana territory, which was very little. Mountains. Cold. Men who trapped animals for their furs. She had read something once in a Harper's magazine about frontier settlements, and she thought she remembered a sentence about how women were scarce in such places, which she supposed was why a man there would be willing to accept whatever a matchmaking broker sent him. The broker's name was Hargrove. She had seen him once, briefly, when he came to the house to finalize the arrangement with her father. He was a round man with a red face and the particular kind of confidence that belongs to men who profit from other people's desperation. He had looked at Clara with a practiced, professional eye, the way a livestock auctioneer looks at a horse, and apparently found her acceptable for his purposes, because the contract was signed that same afternoon while she was in the kitchen being told by the cook to stay out of the way. She never saw what the contract said about her. She had a feeling, looking back on it later, that it didn't describe her accurately. Men like Hargrove didn't traffic in accuracy. They trafficked in possibility. Thursday came with a gray, flat sky and a cold that had teeth in it. Her father drove her to the station himself. They sat in the carriage without speaking for 12 minutes. She counted. When they arrived and the porter took her trunk, her father stepped down from the carriage, straightened his coat, and said, "Right when you're settled." Then he got back in the carriage without waiting to see her walk through the station doors. Clara stood on the platform with her trunk and her train ticket and her coat that was not quite warm enough, and she watched the carriage disappear into the Boston morning traffic, and she thought, he is relieved. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the dismissal, not the contract, not even the fact that she was being sent across the country to marry a stranger. It was that her own father was relieved to be rid of her. She had been an inconvenience for 19 years, and now the inconvenience was being resolved, and she could see it in the way he held his shoulders as the carriage moved away, lighter, somehow, unburdened. She picked up her trunk and walked into the station. The train west was 3 days and 2 nights, and a transfer in Chicago that gave her 4 hours to sit in a cold waiting room eating a hard roll she'd bought from a vendor cart. She had $12 in her coat pocket, everything her father had given her for the journey, and she spent it carefully. The roll in Chicago, a cup of coffee at a station stop in Minnesota where the cold had gone from uncomfortable to something with genuine malice in it, and a secondhand wool scarf from a woman on the train who was getting off in Bismarck and didn't need it anymore. The woman's name was Edna. She was 60 or so, with white hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been used hard and washed clean afterward, and she sat across from Clara for 6 hours and asked her the kind of direct, uncomplicated questions that Clara had almost never been asked before. Where are you headed? Montana Territory, a place called Carver's Creek. Husband? Arranged. Edna looked at her for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who is deciding whether to say what they actually think. You scared? She asked. Clara considered lying. It would have been easier. Yes, she said instead. Edna nodded like this was the correct answer. Good, she said. The ones who aren't scared don't pay enough attention. She gave Clara the scarf when she got off in Bismarck, pressed it into her hands without ceremony, and told her to keep her neck covered because frozen ears were miserable, but a frozen neck could kill you. Clara folded the scarf inside her coat for the rest of the journey, where it held a little warmth like a cupped hand. By the time the train pulled into the settlement station outside Carver's Creek, the world outside the window had gone white and enormous, in a way that made Clara's chest feel strange. Too small, she thought, or maybe too large. She had grown up in a city where buildings created walls and walls created rooms and rooms were what people lived inside of, nested one within the other, always some structure telling you where you were and how much space you were allowed to take up. Out here there was nothing that told you that. The sky went all the way to the ground in every direction, and the snow lay over everything without care or arrangement, and Clara pressed her face closer to the window glass and understood for the first time why people called this place a wilderness. It wasn't about danger exactly. It was about the total indifference of it. Nothing out there cared whether she was there or not, which was perhaps not so different from Boston, she thought, only bigger. The station at Carver's Creek was a wooden platform with a roof over part of it and a pot-bellied stove inside a small building that served as the ticket office and postmaster and presumably several other functions. There were maybe 15 people present when the train arrived. Some waiting for mail, some waiting for passengers, some apparently just there to see what the train brought in, because this was a place where a train arriving was still an event worth attending. Clara stepped off with her trunk and stood on the platform and felt all 15 pairs of eyes move to her. She was used to being looked at. She was not used to being looked at with quite this particular combination of surprise and amusement that she now saw on the faces around her. 2 men near the stove actually exchanged a glance and then looked away, which was worse than open staring because it meant they had communicated something to each other about her without needing to say it out loud. A woman in a heavy brown coat and a hat with a bent brim came over to her. She was somewhere in her 40s with a no-nonsense face and calloused hands. You the Hargrove bride? She asked. My name is Clara Whitmore, Clara said. That's what I said. The woman looked at her with the frank, measuring gaze of someone who was not being unkind, but was also not particularly concerned with being kind. You're not what he described. Clara kept her expression still. I couldn't say what he described. Something more? The woman paused, searching for a word that wasn't insulting, then apparently giving up on the search. Refined, she settled on. I see. Silas won't be pleased. The name landed differently than Clara expected. She had been thinking of her husband to be as an abstraction, a destination, like Montana itself, something she was traveling toward, rather than a specific person with a name and a face and opinions about what his bride should look like. Hearing the name made him suddenly concrete. Silas. Silas Mercer. A man who would not be pleased. "Where is he?" Clara asked. "Coming in from the North Ridge. He'll be another hour, maybe more." The woman looked at Clara's coat. "Come inside before you freeze." Her name was May Caldwell, and she ran the station store with her husband, who was somewhere in the back sorting mail and apparently preferred to stay there. May gave Clara a tin cup of coffee that was mostly hot water but had coffee flavor in it, and told her to sit near the stove while they waited, and then proceeded to ignore her with the efficient tact of someone who has learned that silence is kinder than conversation in uncertain situations. The other people in the station drifted away gradually. The two men by the stove were the last to leave, and one of them, a young man, maybe 20, with a patchy beard, said something to the other as they went out that Clara didn't catch, but the laughter that followed it was the kind that needs no translation. She looked into her coffee cup. She breathed. She reminded herself that she had $12 left and no way to buy a return ticket, and that this was the situation she was in, and that collapsing inside it would not improve it. The hour that followed was the longest of her life up to that point, which was saying something given the previous 3 days of train travel. She sat by the stove and listened to the sounds of the station, the creak of the building under wind, the occasional thump from the back room where May's husband was working, the distant iron clang of the train as it moved further down the line toward whatever was west of here. She turned the frayed end of her scarf between her fingers and did not think about Boston because there was no point in thinking about Boston. And she did not think about what came next because what came next was beyond her ability to plan for. She just sat and breathed and held herself together with the focused, determined stillness of someone who has decided that visible panic is a luxury she cannot afford. She heard him before she saw him. Not loud. He wasn't a loud man. She would learn this later. But there was a quality to the silence that changed when he pushed open the station door, as if the air itself rearranged to accommodate him. He was large in the way that men who spend their lives working in cold and wilderness are large. Not the manufactured bulk of someone who exercises for the purpose of it, but the denser, more functional mass of someone whose body had been built by necessity over many years. He wore a coat that had been patched at least 3 times, and a hat that had seen several winters, and his face was the kind of face the frontier produced, weathered into its best and worst angles simultaneously, neither young nor old, but simply present, fully present, in the way that people who live close to actual danger always are. He stopped 2 steps inside the door and looked at her. Clara looked back. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. It felt significantly longer. "You're not what Hargrove described," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Not unkind exactly, but flat in the way that suggested kindness was something he rationed carefully. "I'm aware," Clara said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I imagine you're Silas Mercer." He didn't answer that. He crossed to the counter where May was appearing from the back room with her husband, who turned out to be a short, bald man named Clarence, who shook nobody's hand and immediately began pretending to reorganize a shelf. "The broker's contract," Silas said to May. May produced a folded document from a drawer under the counter. Silas took it, unfolded it, and read it with the slow care of someone who does not read quickly but intends to miss nothing. His jaw moved once while he read, a small, tight compression of muscle, there and then gone. Clara watched him read her own contract and felt, quite distinctly, like a parcel that had arrived with incorrect postage. When he finished, he folded it and set it on the counter and stood with his hands flat on the wood surface for a moment, looking at neither May nor Clara, but at some middle point between the two of them. "What was she described as?" Clara asked, because she had to know. May made a small, uncomfortable sound. "Slender," Silas said, without inflection. "Light work only, delicate constitution." He looked up at Clara then. "Accomplished in needlework and household music." Clara stared at him. "Needlework," she repeated, "and household music." There was a moment of absolute quiet in which Clara understood precisely what Hargrove had sold this man, not a wife at all, but a decoration. Something to put in a mountain cabin to make it look more civilized. Something delicate that would need protecting, that would look appropriate next to a man of his particular type of roughness. The way a china cup looks appropriate next to a pair of working hands, even when the working hands have no use for china. "I don't play any instrument," Clara said, "and my needlework is functional at best. But I can cook, I learn quickly, and I'm not fragile. She paused. I understand that's not what you were promised, but it's what's available. Silas looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't shift in any direction she could read. Then he turned to May. She need feeding? She's been sitting for 3 hours, May said, which was a yes. He pulled a coin from his coat pocket and set it on the counter. Whatever you've got, he said, and then he walked to the corner of the room furthest from the stove and stood there with his back to the wall, which Clara would later learn was simply how he preferred to stand in rooms, with sight lines to all exits, but which right now just felt like a very deliberate kind of distance. May heated something on the small stove behind the counter that turned out to be a thick soup with venison in it, and she set it in front of Clara with bread that was 2 days old but still edible, and Clara ate it with the focused attention of someone who had not had a proper meal since Chicago and was not going to waste a bite of this one, regardless of how she felt about everything else. Silas watched her eat. She felt it without looking up. She finished the soup, wiped the bowl with the bread, and set her spoon down neatly. All right, she said. She looked across the room at him. What happens now? Something in his expression shifted then. Not much. He was not a man who moved between emotions visibly, but enough that May noticed it too, because she found a reason to look at her husband's shelf reorganization very intently. Winter's setting in, Silas said. I can't leave you here. I'm not asking to be left anywhere. I'm not asking what you're asking for, he said, without particular harshness. I'm explaining the situation. The station can't house you indefinitely. Town's 3 hours back south, and there's no position for you there. My cabin is a day's ride north. Then I'll ride north, Clara said. He looked at her like he was calculating something. Not her appearance this time, something else. The quality of her stillness, maybe. The absence of tears. You ever ridden? He asked. In a park, side saddle. That's not riding. I'm aware. Another silence. Outside, the wind picked up and threw itself against the station walls, and the building made a sound like something living and unhappy. The pot-bellied stove ticked and popped. We leave at first light, Silas said. Clara nodded. All right. You'll sleep here tonight. May can arrange something. I'll manage. He looked at her one more time, with the same unreadable quality that she was beginning to understand was not coldness exactly, but a particular kind of attention. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply watches and records. Then he pulled his hat back on and walked out of the station and didn't look back. May let out a slow breath. Well, she said. He's not happy, Clara said. Silas is never happy. That's not the point. May looked at her with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. The point is, he didn't send you away. Clara considered this. Outside, in the growing dark and the thickening wind, she could hear the wilderness making its particular argument, not in words, but in cold and in space and in the sheer accumulated weight of indifference. It was not a reassuring argument. It was not meant to be. She thought about her father's carriage moving away from the Boston train station, the way his shoulders had lifted. She thought about the word relieved. She wrapped Edna's scarf tighter around her neck and looked at her hands in her lap. Wide hands, her mother's hands, hands that the Boston parlor world had decided were unsuitable. And she made herself a quiet, private promise, the kind that doesn't need witness or ceremony. Just a person, alone with themselves, deciding something. She was here now. She was going north tomorrow into country she'd never seen, with a man she'd known for 40 minutes who had been promised something she wasn't and had not hidden his disappointment about it. She had $12 and a broken trunk latch, and 2 wool dresses and a pair of boots with a worn heel. She had been sent away because someone had decided she wasn't worth keeping. She was going to make them wrong about that. It was not a complicated plan. Most of the important plans aren't. But she held it in her chest like a coal in her cupped hands, small and stubborn and still burning. And when May showed her the narrow back room with the cot and the extra blanket, she lay down in her clothes and her coat, and she closed her eyes and she did not sleep for a long time. But she did not cry either. She listened to the wind working itself against the walls of the station, and she thought, all right, let's see what you're made of. It was not clear whether she was speaking to herself, to Montana, or to some unnamed stubbornness inside her that had been building pressure for 19 years and had finally, in this cold little room at the edge of everything familiar, found enough space to breathe. First light came gray and bitter and absolutely indifferent to how she felt about it. She was already up when May knocked on the door. She had already rebraided her hair and retied her trunk and eaten the half slice of bread May had left on the crate by the door, and she was sitting on the cot with her coat on and her gloves on and her feet flat on the floor, waiting. May opened the door and looked at her and said, "He's out front." Clara stood up. "Good," she said. She picked up her end of the trunk. "Can you get the other side?" May blinked. Then she got the other side of the trunk. Silas was outside with 2 horses and a pack animal that was loaded with supplies. The cold hit Clara the moment she stepped through the door. Hit her everywhere at once, like walking into a wall made of ice. And her breath came out as a cloud of white, and her eyes watered immediately, but she kept her face still, and she did not gasp, and she walked directly to the pack animal and looked at the rope system holding the supplies and asked, without looking at Silas, "What do you need me to do?" There was a pause. "Nothing yet," he said. "Get on the horse." The horse was a brown mare with a patient expression and a tendency, Clara discovered in the first 30 seconds, to test her. The moment Clara was in the saddle, not side saddle, astride, which she had never done in her life, which required a rapid rearrangement of her skirts and her dignity. The mare shifted her weight and turned her head and looked at Clara with one dark eye as if conducting an evaluation. Clara looked back. "Don't," she said quietly. The mare, apparently satisfied, faced forward. Silas, who had been watching this from his own horse, said nothing, but he turned his horse north, and the pack animal's lead rope went taut, and Clara followed, and the station and May and Clarence and the 2 men with the laughing eyes all fell away behind her into the white morning. For the first 2 miles, she concentrated entirely on not falling off the horse. It was more all-consuming than she had expected, not just the balance of it, but the particular language of it, the way the horse communicated through the movement of her muscles, and the angle of her head, the way she had to learn to move with the animal, rather than trying to control her through stiffness. Her thighs burned. Her lower back sent up urgent complaints. She ignored both. The country opened up around them as they moved north, and Clara let herself look at it, truly look at it, not the searching, frightened look she'd given it through the train window, but the look of someone who was now inside it rather than watching it go by. It was staggering. There was no other word. Not beautiful in any conventional sense, not the arranged prettiness of a painted landscape or a park, but something rawer and more serious than that. The mountains sat on the horizon like people who had been there a very long time and had stopped feeling the need to explain themselves. She thought, "I'm going to learn this place." It was not a particularly rational thought, given that she'd been on a horse for approximately 20 minutes and had failed, so far, to learn how to stop her thighs from burning. But it was genuine, and it surprised her, and she held on to it the same way she'd held on to Edna's scarf, carefully, because it was small, and it was hers, and there wasn't much else. They rode for 40 minutes in silence before Silas pulled his horse to a stop and turned in the saddle to look back at her. She had, without realizing it, gradually found a rhythm with the mare. Her posture had straightened. Her grip on the reins had loosened from white-knuckled anxiety to something more functional. She came to a stop beside him looking approximately competent, which was several significant steps better than she'd expected. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the trail ahead. "Hour to the ridge," he said. "Then the hard part." Clara looked at the ridge. It looked from here like the edge of the world. "All right," she said. He turned his horse and kept going. She kept up. The ridge was exactly as bad as it looked. The trail narrowed to something Clara would not have called a trail at all. More a suggestion, really, a place where the rock and snow had agreed, temporarily and without enthusiasm, to allow passage. The horses picked their way along it with the focused, unhurried care of animals that understood the consequences of a wrong step better than any human on their backs, and Clara found herself doing something she hadn't expected, trusting the mare. Not because she had decided to trust her, but because there was nothing else available. The drop on her left side was absolute, a sheer fall into white nothing that her eyes kept returning to despite her best efforts to look elsewhere. She made herself look at the back of Silas's coat instead. It was easier. He hadn't spoken since telling her about the ridge. He moved through the terrain with a particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize. Not tense, not relaxed, but calibrated, like a mechanism running at its proper speed. He checked the pack animal's load twice without stopping, reaching back to test the ropes with one hand while keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. And both times he made small adjustments without comment. The wind came up about halfway across the ridge and hit them sideways with enough force that the pack animal stumbled and threw its head. Clara's mare shied left, toward the drop, and Clara's stomach went somewhere below the saddle before the mare caught herself and steadied. And for approximately 2 seconds, Clara was holding her breath and gripping the reins with both hands, and looking at the edge of the world from a distance she did not find comfortable. Then the mare settled, and Clara breathed, and they kept moving. When they came down off the ridge onto broader ground, Silas pulled up and waited for her to come alongside him. He looked at her with that measuring quality, checking something. "You went left up there," he said. She caught herself. "I know. I'm saying you didn't pull her right." Clara thought about this. He was correct. In the moment when the mare had shied, Clara's instinct had been to hold on rather than to steer, which was precisely backward. "I'll do better," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he nodded once and turned north. She followed, and she thought about the difference between holding on and steering, and she thought it probably applied to more than horses. The cabin was not what she'd imagined. She wasn't sure what she'd imagined exactly. Something rougher, maybe. Something that announced its own harshness more obviously. But the cabin was solid, low and broad, set back against a cut in the hillside that gave it some protection from the north wind, built from timber that had gone gray with weather, but held together with the deliberate competence of someone who had constructed it to last. There was a woodpile stacked along the eastern wall that was taller than Clara and 3 times as wide. A lean-to for the horses. A small outbuilding, she would learn, was for smoking meat. A water barrel frozen solid on the west side. Silas dismounted and went directly to the horses without ceremony. Clara dismounted less smoothly. Her legs had gone partially numb during the last hour of riding, and she grabbed the saddle to keep from folding when her feet hit the ground, and stood for a moment with her forehead pressed against the mare's neck, breathing, waiting for her muscles to remember what they were supposed to do. The mare stood patiently and did not judge her. "Feeling comes back in about 10 minutes, Silas said from somewhere behind her. Not unkind, just factual. "Good to know," Clara said into the mare's mane. He was right. The feeling came back in approximately 10 minutes, mostly in the form of pain, which she had been warned about by nobody and which she chose to interpret as evidence of her legs working rather than evidence of anything being wrong with them. She helped him with the animals, or tried to. She was slow and she got in his way twice, and both times he simply redirected her to a different task without comment, without the particular heavy patience of someone who finds incompetence irritating but is performing tolerance of it. He just said, "Here," instead, and kept moving. Inside the cabin was one main room with a sleeping area curtained off at the back by a heavy wool blanket. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, a cook stove that was cold but showed the black residue of years of heavy use, shelves with organized supplies, a rifle on the wall, and very little else. It was clean in the way that utilitarian spaces are clean, not because someone cared about cleanliness for its own sake, but because disorder in a small space in a dangerous place costs you time you don't have. Silas had the stove going within 10 minutes. Clara stood near it and felt the warmth reach her face and thought about how she had spent 19 years in heated houses and had never once understood what heat actually was until right now. "You cook?" he asked, without looking at her. He was hanging his coat. "Yes." "What?" She thought about the things she had cooked in Boston, which were mostly supervised experiments in a kitchen run by someone else. "Stew," she said. "Bread. I can learn anything." He considered this. "Stew's fine. Supplies are on the middle shelf. Don't touch the top shelf." "What's on the top shelf?" "Medicines, trapping equipment, things that aren't food." "All right." He looked at her then, with the particular directness that was becoming familiar. He looked at people the way he looked at terrain, assessing what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. "The arrangement isn't what I was told it would be," he said. "But you're here, and winter's here. And there's no changing either of those things tonight." "No," Clara agreed. "I won't pretend I'm not irritated about it." "I'd prefer you didn't." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile. She didn't think he produced smiles readily. But an adjacent thing, a slight easing. "Sleep in the back," he said. I'll take the floor." You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm doing it. He turned to the shelf. Find the pot. Middle shelf. She found the pot. The first week was a continuous process of learning things she didn't know, which was exhausting in a way that ordinary ignorance isn't, because ordinary ignorance has limits you can see. The ignorance she encountered in that cabin kept revealing new depths. She didn't know how to build and maintain a fire in a wood stove properly. She knew the general concept, but not the specific management of draft and fuel and timing that kept a stove at the right temperature for cooking without burning through wood faster than necessary. She didn't know how to read weather. She didn't know which supplies needed to be rationed and which were currently plentiful and which were always scarce regardless of supply levels. She didn't know the particular creak the cabin made when the wind was coming from the north versus the northwest, which turned out to matter because one of them meant a storm was likely and the other didn't. Silas did not volunteer information, but he answered questions if she asked them directly, and she asked a great many questions. On the second day, she burned the stew because she didn't understand the stove's particular character yet. Silas ate it without comment, which she would have preferred over charity, but which was also its own kind of dignity. On the third day, she split a log. Not well. She was using her arms instead of the weight of the axe, which she'd been told, and was immediately corrected on this. Let the axe do it. You're fighting it. How do I stop fighting it? Stop gripping so hard. Trust the weight. She tried again. The log split more or less properly, in two pieces that were not identical, but were both firewood. She looked at them. Again, Silas said from behind her. She split another log, then another. After 20 minutes, her shoulders were burning badly enough that she was fairly certain she'd done something unfortunate to muscles she didn't know she had. But the woodpile was genuinely larger, and she set down the axe and looked at what she'd added to it with a feeling she couldn't immediately name. Pride seemed too grand for splitting logs, but it was something in that neighborhood. On the fourth day, the cold worsened. It dropped to a temperature that Silas described as real winter, with the flat tone of someone reporting a weather fact, and which Clara experienced as a thing with physical presence. A weight on her chest when she breathed, a dullness in her hands even inside gloves, a constant negotiation between her body and the air around her. She spent most of that day close to the stove and did not complain about it, and Silas spent most of that day working outside on tasks she couldn't see from the window, and came in for meals only, shaking ice from his coat like it was a minor inconvenience. She watched him come in from the cold that fourth evening, the way he moved, the efficiency of how he shed his outer gear and positioned himself near the heat without crowding it, and she thought about what the woman in the station had said. Silas is never happy. That's not the point. She was beginning to understand what the point was. The point, out here, was function. Whether you could do what needed to be done, when it needed to be done, without requiring the world to arrange itself around your feelings about it. Happiness was a Boston concept. Out here, what you aimed for was something less fragile. She thought she might be able to learn that. She wasn't sure yet, but she thought she might. The snow came on the fifth night and was still coming on the morning of the sixth day, and Silas looked at it from the doorway for a long moment before turning and saying, without particular alarm, "We need more wood inside, 2 days' worth minimum." "I'll help." He looked at her, calculating. "You'll slow it down." "I'll slow it down less than yesterday," she said, "and I'll slow it down less tomorrow than today." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Get your coat." They worked for 3 hours in the falling snow, cutting and hauling and stacking. Clara was slower than him. There was no comparison, and she wasn't attempting to make one, but she was steady. She didn't stop to warm her hands more than necessary. She didn't complain about her back, which had strong opinions about log hauling. When she dropped a length of timber across her foot and swore with a sharpness that she had never in her life permitted herself in Boston, she registered Silas's brief glance in her direction, picked up the timber and kept going. By the time they came in, the woodpile inside was substantial, and Clara's coat was soaked through and her face felt like it had been sandpapered, and Silas looked at the stacked wood and then at her and said, "Faster tomorrow." "Yes," she said. She was already starting on the stove. The snow stopped by evening of the sixth day and left the world outside the cabin changed. Quieter, stranger, everything buried in 2 feet of clean white that had no interest in her opinion of it. Silas went out to check the animals. Clara made dinner and set the table and then stood at the small window and looked at the wilderness wearing its new dress. and she tried to feel frightened and found, to her own surprise, that what she felt instead was something closer to curiosity. She had been afraid on the train. She had been afraid standing on the station platform with 15 pairs of eyes on her. She had been afraid on the ridge, when the mare went left and the drop opened up below. Fear, she was discovering, was not a constant state. It was an event, something that happened at specific moments and then passed through and left something else in its place. What it left, in her case, seemed to be a kind of sharpened attention, a willingness to look directly at things. This was not a quality her father had valued. He had preferred women who looked away from things, who left the looking at things to the men who knew what to look at. She found she could not regret not being that kind of woman out here. Out here, looking away from things would kill you. On the morning of the 8th day, Silas told her he needed to check a trap line to the east and would be gone until late afternoon. I went through the supplies with her, telling her where everything was, not because she didn't know, she'd found most of it already, but because he was someone who made sure things were done properly, regardless. And he told her what to do if the stove temperature dropped too fast, and he told her the rifle on the wall was loaded and she should assume anything that came to the door that wasn't him was not friendly. Animals or men? She asked. Both. Have you had trouble with men? He paused in the act of putting on his coat. Not recently. There was something in that not recently that she didn't push on. I'll be fine, she said. He looked at her for a moment, that particular looking, the kind that took inventory, and then he nodded and he left. The day alone was strange. Not frightening, but strange. The cabin without him in it had a different quality of quiet. His presence, she realized, was something she'd already factored into the background of the space without being conscious of doing so. Not comfort, exactly. More like ballast. A counterweight. Without it, the silence was absolute and the wilderness outside pressed slightly closer, and she was aware in a way she hadn't quite been before of how completely alone they were up here, how far the nearest other person was, how much of daily survival depended on two people functioning together without catastrophic failure. She spent the day usefully. She mended her boot heel using leather and a heavy needle from the top of the sewing supplies she'd found in a tin box under the table. She reorganized the cooking shelf in a way that made more practical sense to her, then second-guessed herself and reorganized it again. She made a list in her head of everything she still didn't know how to do that she needed to know how to do. And the list was long, and she felt no particular panic about its length, just a kind of resolute accounting. When Silas came back in the late afternoon, she had dinner on the stove and the boot mended on the table and 3 mistakes she'd made during the day already cataloged for his assessment. He looked at the boot. He picked it up and examined the mend. Not bad, he said. The stitching on the left side is uneven. I can see that. Still not bad. He set it down and looked at the table and then at her. Trouble while I was gone? Nothing came to the door. He sat down. She served dinner. They ate mostly in silence, which she was becoming accustomed to. His silences weren't empty, she had noticed. They had texture. He thought in them. She had started to think in them too. How long have you been up here? She asked, partway through the meal. He considered whether to answer this, or she thought he was considering it. It might have just been him deciding where to start. 6 years in this cabin, 12 years in the territory. Alone? Mostly. You were married before. It wasn't a question. She'd found evidence of it in the way the cabin was arranged. Small details that suggested at some point someone else had been here and had made choices about where things went, and those choices had been allowed to remain even after she was gone. Silas looked at her across the table, not angry, not wounded, just present. Yes, he said. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. He looked at his plate. Long time ago. She let it rest there. It was not her information to pull at, but she understood something better now about why he'd contracted with a broker, why a man who seemed constitutionally suited to solitude had arranged for a stranger to be sent to his mountain. Because 12 years was a long time, and even people who were suited to solitude sometimes hit a wall inside it that they couldn't get past alone. She didn't say any of that, but she thought it. The cold deepened through the second week, and the work with it. There was always wood to be cut or hauled, always something to check or repair or prepare for. Clara threw herself into it with the kind of systematic determination she had previously applied to surviving Boston parlors, which turned out to be a transferable skill in that it required the same basic mechanics. Assess the room, identify what's expected, learn the rules faster than anyone thinks you can, perform without showing the effort. She was sore every morning for the first 10 days. Not the pleasant soreness of exertion, but the grinding structural soreness of a body being rebuilt for a different purpose. She got up each morning anyway, and she did not move slowly in front of Silas because she had decided early on that visible pain was a currency she wasn't going to spend until she had no other option. On the 11th day, she asked him to show her how to shoot. He looked up from the harness he was mending. Why? Because you said anything at the door might not be friendly, and I don't know how to use the rifle. He considered this for a reasonable 2 seconds. Then he put down the harness. Come on. He was a patient teacher, which surprised her. Not effusive. He didn't praise, he corrected, and the corrections were direct and specific without cruelty behind them. He told her about the kick before it happened, which she appreciated. He told her to breathe out before squeezing, not in. He told her the rifle was not a hammer, that accuracy came from stillness and timing and not from force, and that the impulse to try harder when you missed was almost always the thing that made you miss worse. She shot badly at first, then less badly. By the end of an hour, she had hit the mark twice out of 8 attempts, which Silas told her was mediocre. Mediocre is better than not at all, she said. Mediocre gets you hurt. Good keeps you alive. Then we'll keep practicing. He looked at her with that particular quality again, the one she still hadn't fully mapped, and she thought something moved in it. Something that wasn't evaluation, exactly, or not only evaluation. They kept practicing. It was on the 14th day that the first real test came, the one she hadn't anticipated because it came from inside rather than outside. She was hauling a load of split wood from the pile to the lean-to, a task she'd done several times now without incident, when her foot found a patch of ice under the snow, and she went down hard. Not a gentle slip, but a full-body fall, the kind where your feet disappear from under you faster than your mind can process it, and you land on your back with all the wind knocked out of you at once. She lay in the snow and stared at the sky. The sky was gray and enormous, and absolutely indifferent. She was aware, distantly, of the cold working through the back of her coat. She was aware of the pain radiating from her elbow where she'd caught herself, and from her lower back, and from her pride, which was injured in a way that would not leave a visible mark. She thought about what it cost a man like that to make a small gesture like this, and she thought the cost was probably considerable, and she drank every drop and didn't make anything of it, because she was beginning to understand what he responded to and what he shut away from, and making something of small gestures was one of the things he shut away from. The trapline work took him out 3 more times in the 3rd week. Each time he came back with animals. Some days more than others, some days nothing. And each time Clara had dinner ready and the stove managed and some task completed that he hadn't asked her to do. She wasn't performing competence, she was actually becoming competent, which felt different from the inside, but heavier, more real, less concerned with whether anyone was watching. She learned to read the sky the way he'd never explicitly taught her, but she'd observed carefully enough to work out herself, the particular bruised green-gray that preceded a heavy storm versus the flat white gray of stable cold. She learned the mare, learned her specific personality, the way she communicated with her ears and her weight shifts, the 2 things that genuinely frightened her, and the long list of things that merely annoyed her. She learned how to manage the smoking outbuilding, which was not complicated but required specific attention to ventilation and timing. She did not stop making mistakes. She burned a batch of bread on the 16th day and swore about it with feeling, alone in the cabin, then used the burned loaf as fuel and started again. She misjudged the temperature on a morning in the 3rd week and went out underdressed and came back in with fingers so cold she couldn't feel them and sat by the stove with her hands pressed between her thighs, furious at herself, recalibrating. On the 18th day, Silas came back from the trapline earlier than she expected. She was in the lean-to checking the horses when she heard him come into the clearing, and she came out to find him standing in front of the cabin door, not going in, just standing. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen before, nothing dramatic, no visible distress, but a particular stillness that was different from his usual stillness, like something had drained out of it. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at her. He seemed for a moment uncertain whether to answer. Lost a horse, he said. Sky. The gray. She went through the ice at the crossing. Clara said nothing immediately. She had learned that he didn't want the kind of responses that required him to perform composure he was already performing. She waited. She was 15 years old, he said. The flatness in his voice was the flatness of someone holding something down, not the flatness of someone who didn't feel it. I'm sorry, Clara said. She meant it. He nodded. He went inside. She gave him 20 minutes. Then she brought dinner to the table and sat down across from him, and they ate in the particular silence that is not absence but presence. Two people in the same room with the same weight of the same evening, not needing to narrate it. That night, lying behind the curtained sleeping area, listening to the stove settle and the wind come down off the mountain, Clara thought about how much ground she had covered in 18 days. Not the physical ground, though there was that too, but the other kind, the interior kind. The distance between the girl who had stood on that Boston station platform in a coat too thin for the winter and the woman now lying in a mountain cabin listening to the wilderness make its various arguments outside the walls. She was not the same person. She wasn't entirely certain she'd known the other person well enough to mourn her, but she thought, lying there in the dark with the cold pressing at the edges of the building and the stove pushing back against it, that the exchange was not a loss. She was almost asleep when she heard Silas's voice from across the room, quiet and without particular inflection, the way he said most things. You did all right today, he said. She lay still for a moment. So did you, she said. Silence. The wind, the stove. She fell asleep. The avalanche came on the 23rd day, in the late afternoon, without the long warning she would later learn to listen for. She was on the trail behind the cabin with the pack animal. Silas had asked her to bring the animal up from the crossing, and she had gone alone because she'd done it twice already, and he was occupied with repairs on the outbuilding, when the sound came. Not a roar, not initially, more like an exhale. The mountain breathing out, long and slow, and then suddenly not slow at all. She had half a second to understand what the sound was before the snow came down the slope above the trail in a wave she could not outrun, and could not fight, and could not reason with. The pack animal screamed and lurched forward. The lead rope went taut and yanked Clara off her feet, and she grabbed it with both hands, dug her heels into whatever was under the snow, and held on. The world went white and loud and wrong all at once. The pack animal, 50 pounds of winter supplies, their oil, their dried meat, their extra ammunition, had gone to the edge of the trail where the slope dropped away and was hanging, partially over, the rope. The only thing between its load and a fall that would take everything with it. And the rope was in Clara's hands, and Clara's feet were sliding. She had no plan. There was no time for a plan. She did what her body decided to do, which was to throw herself backward and dig her heels into the packed snow at the trail's edge, and pull with everything she had, every muscle she'd built in 23 days of woodcutting and hauling and refusing to stop. And she felt the rope burn through her gloves, and she felt her arms scream at her, and she thought, very clearly, no, not this, not today. The pack animal scrambled and found purchase on the trail edge and lunged forward, and Clara went down on her back in the snow for the second time in a week, and the rope went slack, and the animal stood trembling 3 feet away, sides heaving, supplies intact. Clara lay in the snow and stared at the sky. She was aware, distantly, of shouting. Then boots hitting the snow at a run. Then Silas was there, crouching over her, his face closer than it had ever been, checking her the way he'd checked her elbow. Methodical, rapid, looking for what was actually wrong. I'm fine, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. He looked at the rope burns on her gloves. He looked at the pack animal. He looked at the slope above where the snow had come down. He put together what had happened without her saying anything, and something in his face changed in a way she didn't have a word for yet. You held it, he said. The supplies, she said. We need the supplies. I know what we need. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood up and went to check the animal. Clara sat up. Her arms were shaking. She looked at her gloves, at the burned lines in the leather where the rope had dragged across them, and she thought, I held it. She had held it. She got up out of the snow without help and went to hold the animal's head while Silas checked the load, and neither of them said anything else about what had just happened, but she felt the air between them had shifted in some way she couldn't yet name, weighted differently, tilted on some new axis that neither of them had measured before. The rope burns healed in about a week. The leather on her gloves hadn't, and she spent 2 evenings patching them with scraps from the mending tin while Silas worked across the table from her on a snapped trap spring, and neither of them mentioned the avalanche directly again. But something about the incident had settled into the space between them differently than before. Not spoken about, not performed, just present. The way a repaired joint is present in a piece of furniture. You can see where it was fixed, and you can trust it more because of it. Silas began showing her things without being asked. Not in any announced or deliberate way. He didn't sit her down and say, "Here's what you need to learn." He simply began doing tasks near her instead of away from her, and explaining what he was doing while he did it, in the same flat, unhurried tone he used for everything else. How to test ice thickness before trusting your weight to it. How to read a snare line for whether an animal had passed and when. How to treat a horse's leg when the cold got into the joints. I explained these things without preamble and without checking whether she was paying attention because he had apparently decided she was always paying attention, which she was. She asked questions, and he answered them, and on the occasions when her question revealed a misunderstanding, he corrected it without making it a lesson. He just corrected it, flatly and specifically, and moved on. This was, she had come to understand, the most efficient form of teaching she had ever encountered. Her Boston tutors had wrapped every correction in so much cushioning that she'd often lost the correction itself inside the packaging. Silas didn't package things, he just handed them to her directly and trusted her to hold them. The month of January brought cold that had a different character than December's cold. December had been startling. January was relentless. There was a quality to it that Clara could only describe as intent, as though it had decided to stay and had arranged itself accordingly. The temperature dropped at night to something that made the cabin walls contract audibly, a low creak that ran through the timber like a sigh, and she learned to bank the stove in the evening with a particular arrangement of fuel that would hold heat through the long dark hours without needing attention. She had taken over most of the cooking by then without it being formally assigned to her. It wasn't that Silas couldn't cook. She'd seen him make meals in his efficient, minimal way, food that was adequate but uninterested in being more than that. But she was better at it, and they both knew it, and so it became hers the way the wood hauling had become a shared task, and the trapline had remained primarily his, a natural division based on capacity rather than any formal negotiation. She experimented within the limits of their supplies, which were real limits. There was a week in mid-January when the venison ran low and they were eating mostly dried beans and hard biscuit, and she found ways to make that less grim than it sounded, adding the last of the dried herbs to the beans, crisping the biscuit against the stovetop, and serving it with the thin broth she made from bones. Silas ate everything she put in front of him without commentary, which she had learned to read as approval. He told her once, in the second month, that she cooked like someone who was paying attention. "Is that a compliment?" she asked. He looked at her. Yes. She thought about it later and decided it was the best kind, the kind that describes what you actually did rather than what you are. The harder thing was the isolation. She had not anticipated how much interior space the silence would demand. In Boston, even in the margins of her father's house, there was always sound. Street noise, servants, the particular bustle of a city that never fully stilled. And that sound had functioned as a kind of wallpaper, something you didn't notice until it was gone and the walls showed beneath it. Up here, the silence was a presence with its own weight, especially on the long afternoons when Silas was on the trapline and she was alone with the stove and the wind and the interior of her own head, which turned out to be more crowded than she'd expected. She thought about her mother, who had died when Clara was 11, and who existed in her memory primarily as a warmth and a smell, and the particular quality of being looked at by someone who saw you clearly and did not find what they saw lacking. She thought about the 3 letters in the tin box in her trunk, which she had not reread since packing them because rereading them hurt in a way she was saving for when she had more capacity for it. She thought about what it meant that her father had packed her off to Montana as a problem to be solved, and whether she was angry about that, and discovered that she was, and that the anger was cleaner than she expected. Not hot and immediate, but settled, like sediment that had found its level, something she could carry without it destabilizing her. She realized somewhere in the 6th week, not unhappy. This surprised her. She examined it carefully, the way you examine an unexpected thing you found, to make sure it was what it looked like. She wasn't comfortable, exactly. Comfort was still several hardships away. She wasn't peaceful, she wasn't content, she wasn't any of the words that women in Boston used to describe the state of domestic satisfaction they were supposed to aspire to. But she wasn't unhappy. She was engaged. She was being asked to do things that were actually hard, and she was doing them. And the doing of them was building something inside her that she hadn't had before and didn't yet have a name for. Silas noticed the change before she did, or at least registered it differently. She realized it on an evening in the 7th week when she looked up from the harness stitching she'd been learning and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the evaluating look, not the measuring look. Something that had more stillness in it. The look of someone who has stopped counting what they have and started simply looking at it. She held his gaze for a moment. He looked back at his work. Neither of them said anything. But the evening had shifted, the way a room shifts when the light changes, and she thought about it afterward in the careful, non-committal way that she thought about things she wasn't ready to decide yet. She had not forgotten that their arrangement was not a real marriage, that it had begun in a broker's fraud, in a contract that described a woman who didn't exist, and that whatever they were building here in this cabin had no ceremony behind it, and possibly no legal standing, and certainly no agreement between them beyond the unspoken, practical agreement of two people sharing space and cold. She held this fact firmly. It was important not to mistake the warmth of proximity for something that had been chosen. But she also watched him come through the door in the evenings, and felt the particular easing in her chest that happened when he did. And she thought that the body was not always wrong about things, even when the mind wasn't ready. The storm that changed everything began on a Thursday in early February, though she only knew the rough day of the week because Silas kept account by notching the door frame, a habit she'd found odd until she understood that time moves differently when you're this far from a calendar. She had been aware for 2 days that something large was building in the north, could feel it in the particular pressure the air had taken on, that tight, heavy quality of incoming weather. Silas had been aware of it longer. He'd been pushing harder on the wood supply and checking every tie-down on the outbuilding with added care, and he'd brought the horses in from the lean-to to the cabin's attached shelter the evening before, which he only did in serious weather. She said nothing about being afraid. She wasn't, entirely. She was alert. The storm hit in the late afternoon with the specific brutality of a Montana winter that has been patient and has decided to stop being patient. The wind came first, a sustained wall of it that hit the cabin like something with muscle, and then the snow behind it, and then a cold that dropped fast enough that she could see her breath inside the cabin within 20 minutes despite the stove running full. The noise was extraordinary, not just loud but dimensional, coming from every direction at once, a total sound that made conversation impossible and thought difficult. Silas moved through it with his usual controlled efficiency, banking the stove, checking the walls, stuffing rags along the base of the door where the wind was finding gaps. Clara worked beside him without being told what to do, because she could see what needed doing. They had been living in the same space for nearly 2 months and had developed, without designing it, a functional shorthand. She knew which tasks were hers and which were his, and which they split, and she moved through that knowledge without needing instruction. It was 2 hours into the storm, maybe 3. Time moved strangely in that noise, when she heard the sound. Not the storm. Beneath the storm. A sound with weight and direction, a deep structural groan from above and behind the cabin, where the hillside rose steeply into the trees. She turned toward it the same moment Silas did. He was across the room before she fully processed what was happening, moving toward her with his hand out, and she had one moment to understand that he was trying to get her away from the back wall when the tree came through. Not all of it. The crown, the top 40 feet, snapped under the accumulated weight of ice and wind and whatever other forces a Montana winter can marshal against a lodgepole pine, and it came through the back left corner of the cabin roof with a sound like the world being taken apart one board at a time. The roof section failed inward. The wall cracked but held. Silas took the main branch across the left shoulder and went down. Clara dropped beside him before the debris had stopped moving. The branch, 8 inches of solid pine, easy, iced over and weighing something she couldn't calculate, lay across his left side from shoulder to hip. He was conscious. She could tell because he was already trying to move, and she put both hands on his right shoulder to stop him. "Don't," she said. "Don't move yet. Let me look." He stopped. He looked at the ceiling, what remained of it, the open hole of it letting in the storm. And she looked at the branch and the way it had fallen and where his body was underneath it, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, all right. What do I know? What do I have?" The branch was wedged at one end against the broken wall section. The other end rested on the floor 3 feet beyond him. It was not resting its full weight on him. The wall was taking some of it, but enough of it was on him that she couldn't get him out from under it without lifting, and lifting it from the middle, where it lay across his body, was not an option because she couldn't get purchase. She looked around the cabin. The storm came through the hole in the roof in cold blasts that were already dropping the temperature and bringing snow in on the floor. She had maybe an hour, possibly less, before the cabin was too cold to work in without serious risk. "Silas," she said, "I need to know if you can feel your legs." A pause. "Yes." "Can you move your right arm?" He moved it, good range of motion. "It's my shoulder," he said, something tight in his voice that was not panic, pain, controlled. "Left shoulder. I can feel it wrong." She thought he meant dislocated, possibly broken. Later she would learn she was half right, badly dislocated, with a crack in the clavicle that had not fully separated. But right now what she knew was that she could not wait for him to help himself. She had to get the branch off him, alone. She went to the woodpile. She went through the cut lengths with her hands, finding 2 pieces. One heavy timber she'd cut from deadfall 3 weeks ago, dense and solid, and one longer, thinner piece that had good straight grain. She brought them back. She drove the dense timber as far under the branch as she could get it, about 2 feet from where it crossed his body, using it as a fulcrum. She positioned the longer piece over it. Then she looked at where to push down, calculated the angle, and put everything she had behind it. It didn't move. She reset her grip. She thought about the axe, about what he'd told her. Trust the weight. Don't fight it. Let the mechanics do what mechanics are for. She pushed again, putting her weight into it rather than her strength, dropping her hips, using her legs, the way she'd learned to use the axe. She felt the fulcrum bite. The branch moved. Not far. 3 inches, maybe 4. But it was enough. Silas understood immediately. He used his right arm and his legs to push himself clear with the grim, focused efficiency of a man working around serious pain, and he got out from under it, and she held the lever until he was clear and then let it back down. The branch settled. The cabin groaned. The storm disagreed with everything. She was kneeling beside him before the sound stopped. He was on his back on the floor with his right hand pressed to his left shoulder, jaw set, looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone conducting an interior assessment of damage. "All right," she said. "I need to get you near the stove. Can you help me?" "Right side only." "I can walk," he said. He could not walk without her. He didn't want to need her, and she didn't comment on it, just put herself under his right arm and took his weight, and they moved across the cabin to the area nearest the stove, which was still burning, thank God for that. And she got him down on the floor with his back against the wall, and his legs stretched out, and then she went immediately to the roof hole. She couldn't fix it. She could manage it. She dragged the heavy wool blankets from the sleeping area and used the 2 longest ones to block the worst of the opening, wedging them against the broken timber and the intact roof beams. And it was imperfect and temporary, and it reduced the draft by perhaps 60%, which was not enough but was more than nothing. She built the stove as high as she dared. Then she went to the top shelf, the medicines shelf, and she found what she needed: the willow bark, the wrapped linen strips, the small bottle of alcohol that she had noted once and filed away. She came back to him and knelt. His face had gone gray under the weathering, not from blood loss, she checked, no serious bleeding, but from pain and the sustained effort of managing it. He watched her go through what she'd taken from the shelf with something that was not quite trust and not quite resistance, a middle quality, assessing. "You know what you're doing?" he asked. "Mostly," she said, which was more honest than reassuring, but was what he would want. She had helped the cook in Boston when the woman had injured herself one winter, had watched the doctor work, had asked questions that everyone thought were strange for a girl to ask, and which she had asked anyway. She cleaned the scrape along his jaw where the branch had caught him first. She examined his shoulder as carefully as she could without moving it more than necessary, and what she found confirmed her first assessment. The joint was wrong, And the bone had something wrong with it too. Resetting a dislocated shoulder was something she had a theoretical knowledge of and zero practical experience with. "This is going to hurt," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I've gathered that. I don't want to make it worse, but leaving it displaced is worse than fixing it wrong. You're asking my permission. I'm telling you what I know and don't know, so you can decide." Something moved in his face. He looked at her for a moment. Not the measuring look, not the evaluating look, but something more direct than both. "Do it," he said. She did it. It took 3 attempts, and the second attempt was the bad one, and Silas made a sound she had never heard him make. A short, controlled sound that was clearly the smallest possible expression of what he was actually experiencing. On the 3rd attempt, the joint found its place with a sensation she felt through her hands as much as heard, and Silas went very still. His face was white. His jaw was so tight it looked structural. "Done," she said. He breathed. She watched him breathe, 4 times, 5, the color coming back in increments. "Done," he repeated, like he was checking the word. She wrapped the shoulder, not tightly, just enough to keep him from moving it by instinct. And she made the willow bark tea, and she made him drink it while it was still hot, and she thought, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor beside him, with the storm coming through the imperfect blanket barrier she'd put over the hole, and the stove working as hard as she could make it work, that this was the most frightened she had been since arriving in Montana. Not frightened for herself. Frightened for him. This was new information. She stayed close through the night, not sleeping, feeding the stove every hour, checking on him each time she was up. He slept badly. She could tell by the quality of his breathing, the way it changed when pain woke him. But he slept enough. The cabin held. The blankets over the hole held him perfectly, and let in cold and some snow, and she dealt with both as they presented themselves, quietly, without waking him. By morning, the storm had broken and the light came in through the hole she'd patched and through the 2 small windows as a clean, brutally clear winter light that made everything look sharp and a little unreal, the way the world looks after something big has passed through it. Silas woke and looked at the ceiling and at the blanket patch and at the debris on the floor and then at Clara, who was sitting in the chair by the stove with a cup of tea she'd made when the light first came up. "How long did you sleep?" he asked. "I'll sleep later." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the hole in his roof. "The branch is still in there." "Yes. I can't move it alone. And I thought moving you to move it was the wrong order." He was quiet. She watched him work out, from the inside of his own body, what the night had cost him and what function he had left. His face did the internal math. "I need to get up," he said. "Not yet." "Clara—" "Not yet," she said again, steadier. "You need another hour at least. The roof isn't going anywhere. Drink something." He looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He lay back. This was the moment she understood something that she hadn't known she was waiting to understand. He trusted her. Not in the abstract, not as a policy, not because he'd decided to be generous about it. He trusted her because she had earned it, item by item, in cold and in failure and in rope burns and in one very bad night, and the trust was real because it had been built from real material. She poured him a cup and brought it to him, and he took it without argument. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the winter, though not in the way that the early weeks had been hard. The early hardness had been about her learning, about building capacity where none existed. This hardness was about carrying more than her share while Silas healed, and doing it in the aftermath of a storm that had compromised their shelter and their resources simultaneously. The hole in the roof got a temporary fix 2 days after the storm, when Silas was mobile enough to assist and she could do the actual climbing, which he could not. He directed from below. She went up with timber and an iron spike and did what he told her, and the fix was ugly but it sealed, and that was what mattered. She took over the horse care entirely. She took over the woodpile. She did not take over the trapline. She told him plainly that she didn't know it well enough yet to manage it without him. But she went with him the 2 times he insisted on going out too early, walked beside him in case he needed steadying, and he needed it once and didn't comment on it, and neither did she. On the evenings when the pain was bad enough that she could see it in the set of his face, she made the willow bark tea without asking and set it on the table, and he drank it without commenting on it either. This was their language now, the language of 2 people who had stopped performing around each other's needs and had started simply meeting them. It was in the 4th week of his recovery, on a night when the cold had finally eased its grip by a few degrees, and the stove didn't have to work as hard, and the cabin felt, for the first time in a while, like something approaching ordinary, that he told her about his wife. Her name had been Mara. She had come from a family in the territory. Not Boston, not from any city, a frontier family who had been in Montana for 20 years and had built something real here. She had known what the mountains were from the beginning and had loved them anyway, or loved them because of what they were. She had died in the 3rd year of their marriage, from a fever that came on fast and didn't stop. "I couldn't get her out," Silas said. He was looking at the table. "Snow came in hard that week. I couldn't get her down the mountain to a doctor in time." Clara held the cup in her hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than what he'd just handed her. "When Hargrove came through last spring," he said, "I thought—" He stopped. Started again, differently. "I thought having someone here again was better than not. That was the whole of my thinking. It wasn't a good reason." "It was an honest one," Clara said. He looked up at her. "You weren't looking for a decoration," she said. "Whatever Hargrove told you he was sending, you were looking for someone who could survive here. That's honest." He was quiet for a long time. The stove settled. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees and came down as a low sound, something between a voice and a sigh. "You can do more than survive here," he said. Clara looked at him across the table. She thought about the girl who had stood on the Boston platform in a coat too thin, who had never split a log or shot a rifle or reset a dislocated shoulder by firelight in the middle of a Montana storm. She thought about what it had taken to become the woman sitting here right now, and how none of it had been given to her. Every piece of it had been built, by her own hands, from cold and failure and stubborn refusal to break. "I know," she said. He nodded. Not a declaration. Not a turning point you could put a name on. Just two people in a cabin at the end of a hard winter, telling each other true things and knowing they were heard. But it was the first time she had said, "I know," without apology, without hedging, without looking at the floor. She said it the way someone says a thing they have earned the right to say, and she felt the truth of it all the way down, in her palms, in her shoulders, in the healed rope burns, and the cooking calluses, and the cold strengthened legs that could now carry her up a trail she had once barely survived on horseback. The woman Hargrove had described didn't exist. She never had. The woman who existed was something else entirely, and she was just beginning to understand what. Spring came to the mountains the way it always does at elevation, reluctantly, in stages, with frequent reversals that reminded you it hadn't actually committed to anything yet. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, exposing ground that was black and saturated and smelled like something waking up from a long, difficult sleep. The creek below the cabin, which had been locked since November, broke open in the second week of March with a sound Clara heard from inside the cabin and went to the door to listen to. A low, sustained cracking, like the mountain clearing its throat. Silas's shoulder had healed well enough by then that he'd stopped favoring it in any visible way, though she noticed on cold mornings that he rolled it once before starting work. A small private checking in with the joint that he probably didn't realize he was doing. She didn't mention it. She noticed a great many things about him by then that she kept to herself, filed away in the part of her mind that had been building a quiet, careful portrait of him since January. The roof repair they'd done in the storm's aftermath held through the rest of winter, which was either a tribute to her execution of his instructions or to the mercy of the weather not testing it again. In early March, when the worst of the cold had eased enough to work outdoors without the time limit that serious cold imposed, they redid it properly. She handed materials up, and he did the high work, moving across the roof with a carefulness that was new and that he accepted without comment. And they finished in an afternoon, and she made dinner while he came down and cleaned the debris, and neither of them made anything of the fact that they'd built something together that would last. The trapline had a good late winter run. He came back in the third week of February with more than he'd expected, and she helped him work the pelts. He showed her once, correctly, without softening what it was, and she learned it the same way she'd learned everything else up here, by paying attention and doing it until she could do it right. The work was not pleasant, she didn't pretend it was. But unpleasant and unworthy were not the same thing, and she had stopped confusing them sometime around January. By April, she was riding the trapline with him on the shorter circuits. Not every time. There were days when the cabin needed her more, but enough that she knew the trail, knew the markers, knew which sets were his most productive and which he maintained more out of habit than hope. She learned that he'd built the line over 8 years, that every anchor post and clearing marker represented a decision he'd made alone in country. He'd had to learn by moving through it and being wrong about it repeatedly. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she'd ever seen. 8 years of a man's specific attention to one piece of the world, recorded in wood and wire, and his own accumulated failures. She told him this one morning on the trail, not as a compliment but as an observation, the way she'd learned to say things to him. He looked at her from his horse. He thought about it. "Took me 3 years to stop making the same mistakes," he said. "What kind of mistakes?" "Impatience, mostly. Setting too fast, moving too soon, assuming I knew something I didn't know yet." She nodded. She knew something about that. April turned into May, and the days lengthened, and the country changed in ways that she was only beginning to have the vocabulary for. The tree line darkened as the pines took on new growth. The creek ran full and loud, and the horses were better tempered for having grass again. She planted a small kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin, not from any grand plan, but because she'd found a tin of seed in the supply stores, and it seemed wasteful not to, and because she had taken to improving whatever she could reach. It was in May that she rode down to Carver's Creek for the first time since arriving. Silas needed to sell pelts at the trading post and have the saddle repaired at the smith, and she went with him because she wanted to see May, who had sent a message up with a passing hunter in March, checking that they'd survived the winter, to which Clara had sent back 3 lines saying they had. May looked at her the way people look at someone they expected to be one thing and found to be another. She said, standing in the station store with Clarence doing his shelf reorganization nearby, "You look different." "I lost some weight," Clara said, "and gained it back in different places." May laughed, which surprised her. She hadn't thought of May as a person who laughed easily. "That's one way to put it," May said. She looked past Clara to where Silas was talking with 2 men outside, and there was something in how she looked that Clara couldn't read entirely. "He looks different too," May said. "Less like he's working at something he doesn't want to be working at." Clara considered this. "He's healing well," she said. "That's not what I meant." Clara looked at her. May looked back with the frank, undecorated gaze that she'd offered since the beginning, the kind that didn't need you to understand it fully to know it was offered in good faith. "I meant he's easier," May said, "for the first time in about 3 years." There was not much to say to that, so Clara said nothing, and May found her something to eat, and they talked about the winter and what news had come through the station in the months since, which was not much, because news traveled slowly up here, and some of it arrived already old enough to have lost its urgency. The mining operation at the North Ridge had expanded, May said. A company called Alderton Mining, out of Chicago, had bought up 3 of the independent claims over the winter and was bringing in equipment. There were more men in the territory than there'd been last year, mostly following the work. "Silas knows about Alderton?" Clara asked. "Everybody knows about Alderton. Whether they're happy about it is a different question." May's expression said she was in the not happy category. "They're buying land alongside the creek, water rights." Clara thought about the creek below their cabin, the one she'd listened to break open in March. "Our creek?" she asked. "Your section of it is your section, but water doesn't know property lines." May shrugged, which was the gesture of someone who had enough problems and was being careful about which additional ones she picked up. "It'll shake out one way or another." Silas said nothing on the ride home about Alderton, so Clara didn't press it, but she filed it. She was good at filing things. The summer that followed was the fullest period of her life up to that point, and she would later think of it as the season when she stopped being someone who was surviving Montana and became someone who simply lived there. The distinction was interior, but it was real. She stopped waking up in the morning with the low-level calculation of what she needed to get through the day and started waking up with something closer to appetite, not for anything specific, just for the day itself, for what it would ask of her. She rode well now, not like Silas, who moved with his horse the way water moves with a riverbed, but well. She could handle the mare in difficult terrain without white-knuckling it, could feel what the horse was communicating and respond to it in something approaching conversation. She shot with accuracy that Silas described as adequate, which she had come to understand meant good. She could read the sky, manage the stove, dress and preserve game, navigate by landmarks on ground she knew, and maintain all the basic systems of the cabin and its outbuildings without instruction or assistance. These were not the things she had been sent west to be. She thought about that sometimes, about Hargrove's contract, about needlework and household music, about the decorative wife that man had invented and sold, and she felt something that was not quite anger anymore, was past anger into something more like clarity. She had come here as someone else's idea of what she should be, and she had become something nobody had thought to design. She liked that. She liked it with a fierceness that surprised her sometimes. It was a Tuesday in July. She knew the day because they'd been down to the creek station the previous Friday, and May had given her a current almanac when the stranger arrived. She was in the garden when she heard the horse on the upper trail, and she straightened up and shielded her eyes and watched the animal come down through the trees. One horse, one rider, moving with the deliberate care of someone who didn't know the trail. Not a mining man. She'd seen several of those over the spring, and they moved in groups and wore a particular kind of confidence that this rider did not have. This was a city horse, she noticed. Well-kept, clean-legged, with good tack that hadn't been used hard. The man on it was perhaps 50, with a round face and careful clothes, careful in the way that expensive clothes are careful, designed to look significant without looking ostentatious. He wore a hat that was wrong for the country. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin and then at Clara in the garden with an expression she recognized from Boston. The expression of a man locating a woman in his mental map of the scene. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for a Mrs. Clara Mercer, formerly Clara Whitmore." Clara straightened. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. She still used it. They hadn't formalized the marriage beyond the broker's contract, a thing that had simply never come up, and she wasn't going to claim a name she wasn't sure was hers. The man dismounted. He introduced himself as Pemberton, representing the estate of Aldous Whitmore of Boston, and at the name of her father, Clara felt something in her chest do a slow, cold turn, the way a compass needle turns when it finds north. "My father," she said. "The late Aldous Whitmore," Pemberton said, with the particular professional gentleness of a man who delivers news of death often enough to have developed a method for it. "I'm very sorry, Miss Whitmore. He passed in April. Heart failure." April. While she had been riding trap lines and planting gardens and watching spring come up the mountainside, her father had died in his Beacon Hill house, and she hadn't known. She thought about how she felt about this, and found the feeling complicated in ways she wasn't going to sort through in front of a stranger, so she set it aside and looked at Pemberton. "You've come a long way," she said. "Come inside." Silas was back by the time she'd put water on, coming in from the north pasture, where he'd been checking the fence line, and he saw Pemberton in the cabin and looked at Clara with a question in his face that she answered with a slight shake of her head that meant wait. She poured coffee. They had real coffee, a supply she'd bought in Carver's Creek with the last of her $12 back in April. And she set it in front of Pemberton and stood at the end of the table and let him talk. He talked for a while. He was a thorough man. He had papers, which he arranged on the table with the care of someone who has traveled a long way with important documents and wants full credit for their safe arrival. I explained that Aldous Whitmore had died without a male heir, that Clara was his only surviving child, that the estate, the house, the investments, the various financial instruments that a man of his position accumulated over a lifetime, came to a sum that Pemberton named carefully and precisely, the way you name a number when you want to make sure it lands. It landed. Clara's hands were in her lap under the table, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and kept her face still. The number was significant. It was the kind of number that changed things, that paid for a different life, a different city, a different version of who you were going to be. That was the point of saying it precisely. That was why Pemberton had ridden 3 days from the nearest rail connection to say it in person. "There is a condition," Pemberton said. There it was. "What condition?" Clara asked. Pemberton looked briefly at Silas, then back at Clara, with the particular look of someone about to say something awkward. "The estate includes a codicil added in December of last year. Your father specified that to receive the inheritance in full, you must return to Boston, take up residence in the family home, and, this is his language, I want to be precise, dissolve any frontier arrangement and resume your standing in proper society." The room was quiet. Silas, she knew without looking at him, had gone very still. "He called it a frontier arrangement," Clara said. "His language, as I said." "What happens to the estate if I decline?" Pemberton shifted slightly. A charitable endowment. Several institutions named in the will. He paused. I want to be clear, Miss Whitmore. This would be a very substantial loss. The kind of resources being discussed could support considerable comfort, education, travel, social position. I understand what money buys, Clara said. Pemberton stopped. She looked at the documents on the table. There were several pages, official and formal, dense with the legal language that was her father's final voice. Even in death, speaking to her in terms and conditions. She thought about his parlor. She thought about the envelope that had hit her across the face. She thought about the carriage moving away from the Boston station and his shoulders lifting. Can I have until morning? She said. Pemberton nodded. He had expected this, had probably planned for it, had a place to stay arranged somewhere. May's station, probably. He collected his papers with professional efficiency and expressed condolences she knew were routine and left. The cabin was quiet. Clara stood at the table for a moment, looking at where the papers had been. Then she sat down in her usual chair and looked at the middle distance. Silas poured himself coffee. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. She appreciated this about him. She always had. The way he understood that some things needed space before they needed words. After a while, she said, He put a codicil in December. I heard. That was a month after Hargrove sent me here. He knew where I was. He knew what he'd done, and then he wrote a will that said I had to undo it to receive any of it. She heard her own voice as she said this, trying to locate what was in it. I don't know if that's cruelty or a kind of guilt. Could be both, Silas said. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. His face had the quality she'd first thought was blankness and had learned was something else. The contained expression of a man being careful about how much he reveals in a moment that isn't his. You should think about it properly, he said. That's real money. I know what it is. I mean, he stopped, started again. Clara, I don't want you deciding tonight I don't want you deciding quickly because of how things are between us. That money is your future, a different kind of future than this. He looked at the cabin around him, not with embarrassment, but with honesty. This is a mountain cabin. It's cold for 7 months. The work is hard every day, and some days it's dangerous. You've earned your place here, and you know that. But you came here with no choice. You should have one now. She looked at him. He meant it, every word of it. That was the thing about Silas. He didn't say things for effect. He said things because they were true, and the truth of this one was plain on his face. He was telling her to think about leaving, and it was costing him something to say it, and he was saying it anyway. She thought about what kind of man did that, and what it meant about him. Go to bed, she said. I'll think about it tonight. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and got up and went to the sleeping area, and she sat alone at the table with the stove ticking and the summer night pressing mild and dark against the cabin windows. She thought about Boston. She tried to be rigorous about it, tried to give it a fair rendering, not the parlors and the silence and her father's considered dismissals, but the real things, the things money could genuinely buy. A warm house staffed by people whose job it was to manage it. Food that didn't require knowing how to hunt. A doctor within a reasonable distance. Books? She missed books, genuinely missed them. Music. The texture of a city, the particular aliveness of many people living close together, the sense of being part of something larger than two people on a mountain. She gave these things their full weight. She sat with them. Then she thought about the ridge, about the moment the mare went left and she hadn't pulled right, and what Silas had said afterward, not criticism, just correction, just the truth of what had happened and what to do differently. She thought about the avalanche and the rope in her burning hands, and the clear, absolute no she had felt in her body. She thought about the branch and the fulcrum and the lever she had built from broken timber to lift the impossible weight, and Silas's face when she'd gotten him clear, not gratitude exactly, something more than that, something that didn't have a word because it was about more than gratitude. She thought about what May had said, less like he's working at something he doesn't want to be working at. She thought about the way he'd said, this is a mountain cabin. It's cold for 7 months. Not apologetically, not dismissively, but honestly, as a man who knew exactly what he was and what he could offer and what he couldn't, and was giving her the fullest possible picture because he thought she deserved a full picture. She thought about the inheritance papers on this table tomorrow morning, and her father's hand in the codicil, The final management of her from beyond whatever had happened to him in April in a house she would never live in again. Around midnight, she made herself a cup of tea and sat back down. She had been 19 when she arrived. She would be 21 in September. In the distance between those two numbers was an entire other person, not replaced but transformed, the way material is transformed when you work it hard enough for long enough. The Boston Clara had been defined by what she lacked, what she failed to measure up to, what the world decided she was not. The Clara who sat here now with calloused hands and a real knowledge of how to keep two people alive through a Montana winter was defined by what she could do, and the list was long and specific and entirely hers. She was not going to trade that, not for money, not for position, not for the version of respectability that required her to walk back into her father's house and pretend the last 2 years had been a regrettable detour on the way to becoming what he'd always wanted. She was not a detour. She was a destination. She sat with this a while longer, not because she needed more time to decide, but because she wanted to know her own mind completely before morning, wanted to arrive at Pemberton's meeting without any pocket of doubt she hadn't examined. She turned the decision over in her hands, looking at every side of it, the way Silas turned a trap spring, making sure he understood it before he relied on it. She didn't find any doubt she hadn't already seen. What she found instead, sitting in the quiet of the summer night in the cabin she had helped to patch and maintain and heat through a long and difficult winter, was something she recognized by now. The particular stillness of a decision that is finished, the way a joint settles when it finds its place. She went to bed. In the morning, Pemberton arrived at the time he'd said he would, precise in the way that lawyers are precise. He sat at the table. He had his papers. He looked at her with the professional neutrality of a man who had seen people make this decision in both directions and had learned not to predict. Silas stood near the door, not between her and Pemberton, not placing himself anywhere that suggested she needed managing, just there, present, the way he was always present. Enough. Clara sat down across from Pemberton. She looked at the papers. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, "I want to ask you something honestly, and I'd like you to answer honestly." "Of course," he said. "The codicil, the condition about dissolving the arrangement and returning to Boston." She looked at him. "Was that punitive, do you think? Or was it something else?" Pemberton was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man deciding how honest to actually be. Then he said, "I can't speak to your father's intentions. I can tell you he added the codicil himself, in his own hand, without consulting me beforehand. That is unusual." "Unusual how?" "Men of his position usually have their lawyers draft codicils. When they write them by hand, it's typically because what they want to say doesn't come out right in formal language." He paused. "That's my observation, not a legal opinion." Clara looked at the papers. Something in what Pemberton had just said moved in her like water finding a level. Her father, sitting down with a pen and writing something he couldn't say properly through a lawyer. She didn't know what that meant. She wasn't sure she'd ever know what it meant. But it changed the shape of the thing slightly, made it less a weapon and more she didn't know. A failed gesture, maybe. Something from a man who had spent 19 years not knowing how to say what he meant, making one last attempt in handwriting rather than legal language. It didn't change what she was going to say, but it changed how she held it. She reached across the table and picked up the inheritance document. She read it through, all of it, slowly, the way Silas had read the broker's contract on the first day in the station, not willing to miss anything. Then she set it down. "I'm not returning to Boston," she said. "I'm not dissolving this marriage. I'm not resuming my standing in proper society, as my father put it, because the society he meant was never interested in my standing." She kept her voice even. "I'm sorry for the journey, Mr. Pemberton. I know that's not what you came here to hear." Pemberton looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore," he said, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Mercer, I've delivered this type of message before. I've not often seen someone read the entire document before answering." "I like to understand what I'm saying no to," Clara said. He nodded. He collected his papers one last time, and he stood, and he put his hat on. He looked at Silas by the door, then back at her, and something in his face was not the professional neutrality it had been before. "Your father also sent something else," he said. He reached inside his coat and produced a small envelope. Not official, no legal weight to it, just her name on the outside in handwriting she knew from childhood. I was instructed to leave it regardless of your decision. He set it on the table. He said good morning. He left. The cabin was quiet. She looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up immediately. She sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something you know is going to cost you before you open it. Silas came away from the door. He came to the table and stood beside her, and he put his hand on the table near hers. Not touching, just near. I'll go see to the horses, he said. She nodded. He went out. She picked up the envelope. Her father's handwriting on the outside was different from how she remembered it. Smaller somehow, less certain. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, not long, not formal. He did not apologize. That would have been too large a word for him, too exposed. What he wrote instead were facts. That he had been wrong to send her away the way he had. That he had known for some time that he had been wrong. That he did not expect her to come back. The last line surprised her. I do not expect you to come back. What I hope is that you are not cold. She read that line twice. Then a third time. What I hope is that you are not cold. She thought about the man who had watched her carriage leave the Boston station with his shoulders lifting, relieved. She thought about the man who had written that line in his own hand without telling his lawyer. She thought about how a person could be both of those things simultaneously, and how that was probably the most honest thing about him. Not the relief, not the guilt, but the fact that he was both fully, without the capacity to resolve either. She held the letter for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box in her trunk, with her mother's things, with the 3 letters tied in ribbon. It belonged there, she thought, with the other pieces of her history that were complicated and real and hers to carry. She was not cold. She went outside to find Silas. He was at the fence near the pasture, doing something that could have waited, the specific kind of non-urgent task a man finds when he is giving a woman time and doesn't want to look like that's what he's doing. She walked across the yard toward him, and he heard her coming and straightened and looked at her. Done? He said. Done, she said. He looked at her face, reading it the way he read terrain. Whatever he found there settled something in him. She saw it happen. That particular easing she'd first noticed in herself and had now learned to recognize in him too. She wasn't going back, he said. Not a question. No, Clara said. She wasn't. He nodded. He turned back to the fence. She leaned against the post beside him and looked out at the pasture, at the horses moving in the summer grass, at the mountains above the tree line still carrying snow on their high faces even in July. I want to learn the full trap line, she said. All of it, before fall. He glanced at her. That's 40 miles of trail. I know. He was quiet for a moment, then, we'll start Thursday. She nodded. The sun was high, and the day was warm, and the mountains were doing what mountains do, holding their ground, indifferent to everything below them, asking nothing from anyone, offering everything to whoever was willing to do the work of learning them. She was willing. She had been from the beginning, even when she hadn't known it yet. Thursday, she thought. Thursday was fine.